So welcome everybody to this fantastic online book launch. I'm Dr. Nicholas Campion. I am director of the Sophia Centre at the University of Wales Trinity St David, and I'm delighted that we can host this launch of the new book, Mattering the Invisible, Technologies and Bodies in the Realm of the Spectral, published by Berghahn Books and edited by Diana Espirito Santo, who is Associate Professor at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and Jack Hunter, who is a research fellow with the Religious Experience Centre at the University of Wales Trinity St David, and a tutor on 2 master's programs in cultural astronomy and ecology and spirituality. Just on a technical matter, as everybody knows now in Zoom meetings, if you mute your microphone unless you are speaking. And so it's my great delight to hand over, first of all, to Diana Espirito Santo. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you. I first want to thank the University of Wales, Trinity St David, and especially Nicholas Campion for organizing the launch of this book, Mattering the Invisible. It is an honor to be launched, so to speak, in the Sophia Centre for Cosmology and Culture, which has been a long-standing and globally unique research center for understanding cultural notions of astronomy, astrology, and outer space, certainly very relevant to the theme that I develop in my chapter, UFOs in Chile. In this regard, this context of launch also shows that this book goes beyond anthropology, even though its grounding is anthropological. I'm saying this not just in terms of its appeal, but in what it intends to do, which is to open up ethnography, the facts of our interlocutors' lives and truths, to different scholarly and non-scholarly perspectives. The book is about the invisible, as the title suggests, but this needs to be qualified. It seems more of an ironic invisible that we're actually referring to. The initial title was actually Mattering the Paranormal. Certainly for most people who experience the spiritual or the ghostly or the spectral, it is not invisible or intangible, but manifest, concrete, even if at the limits or margins of experience or perception. But the fundamental question we ask here is how these experiences become material, or rather how these are mattered into becoming what they are. This includes a transformational aspect. The idea is that there's a fundamental coupling of our concepts and our experiences with the matters of the world, be this coupling dialectic, discursive, simultaneous, or any other configuration specific to an event, experience, or person. Our interest here is in what we term paranormal matter, the objects, instruments, apparatuses, technologies, and bodies that both mirror and represent and bring novel aspects of the paranormal, of the unseen or the spiritual into being. Indeed, there's a cosmogonical element to mattering the unseen, we propose. Matter is not just mediatory, framed as a media for the transcendent or the like. Throughout the book, we explore the idea that materials, technologies, and objects of varying kinds substantially modify the experience of the paranormal itself and what it can become. In this sense, we follow media theorists Galloway, Thacker, and Wark, who argue that media do not always mediate. Mediation as a theory is insufficient to account for moments where there is an impossibility or insufficiency of communication or representation, either because the phenomena in question being mediated is ineffable, or because there's a darkness, a refusal to abide by the rules of the communicational game. The authors in these chapters all work with different versions of this idea, where some are more mediatory than others. In the introduction, we do 2 things, which are then taken up once more in the conclusion. First, we show that historically, the link between the invisible dimensions of life and matter does not reduce to mediation. We look at mesmerism, spiritualism, psychical research, and other occult sciences of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries to show that while, as Gons notes, they produced the first modern fantasies of discorporative electronic liberation, on the other, matter, devices, technologies, and bodies, was simultaneously enmeshed in a web of knowledge and effect in which it absolutely transcended its place in this dualistic universe. Force fields, vibrating patterns, alchemy, the spiritual refinement of matter, all of these pushed existing categories to their limits. They didn't stay within these dualist boundaries. Indeed, technologies were never completely material in their machinations either. The second thing we do in the introduction is to argue against the more traditional anthropological notion that objects have agency. We propose, following theorists of material semiotics, that people matter the invisible in different ways. This is also an ontological question, not just a shift in theoretical perspectives. In contrast to theorists who believe that there's a real world to be contrasted with an enchanted one, filled with beliefs of all sorts, we think that worlds are performed and enacted through different material and relational forms and thus become real. In this sense, we echo William James, for whom truth happens to an idea. I quote, "It becomes true, it's made true by events. Its verity is in fact an event, a process, the process namely of its verifying itself, its verification." This is almost the opposite of the normative stance, which starts with a single truth about the natural world and attempts to contextualize how others believe differently. We therefore argue that it makes sense to rethink the purely communicational or propositional content or dynamic of technologies, which is premised exactly on this vision of a single reality. It makes more sense to think in terms of forces, fields, affects, ontological contiguities, spectra, ambiguities, and assemblages than it does in terms of discrete entities divided into sender and receiver, or into immanent and transcendent, or indeed imagination and reality. What is exciting for me, at least about this proposition, is that it also means that there may be no stable project of mattering the invisible, the spiritual, or the paranormal in any given arrangement. We may not have a continual production of something we call spiritual or godly or divine, but one that is there only intermittently, conditionally, in a patchwork or through local and partial connections, as John Law and Anne-Marie Moll have suggested. Perhaps there's no whole or totality when we speak of experiencing the paranormal through matter or media or technology. Certainly there are strategies, languages that accompany materiality in each one of the case studies. But what these models show is that the phenomena they produce are deeply heterogeneous. I think this is also what the varied authors contributing to this book ultimately show, that we need to move from totalizing visions of religious and spiritual and paranormal phenomena, ones that rely on outdated notions of mind, self, and other, to a recognition of the imminent instability and fragility of this mattering endeavor for those who engage in it. I thank you all for being here and for your interest in what we have to say. I now pass the word to my co-editor, Jack Hunter. And just a word on how this book launch is going to proceed. So Jack is going to describe a bit of his chapter. And then each of the authors, in turn, in order of the chapters of the book, will briefly also describe the contents of their own chapters. And then at the end, we'll have a few minutes for questions and discussion and comments. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Diana. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, so I'm just gonna give a little kind of a brief introduction to what my chapter in the book is all about. The title of the book is Organicism, of the chapter, sorry, is Organicism and Psychical Research, Where Mushrooms and Mediums Meet. And the chapter begins really from my own ethnographic observations of trance and physical mediumship, which is what my PhD research was all about. And my experience of not only watching the process of development of mediumship, but also participating in it myself and the experiences that I had. And what I noticed was that, you know, in kind of like in the spiritualist movement, which started off, you know, in the middle of the 19th century, there's always been this kind of fascination with science and a kind of tendency to look at sort of paranormal and spiritual phenomena through the lens of scientific models and frameworks, and especially through reductionist models and frameworks. So, for example, the idea of the medium, as someone who is kind of like a receiver of information or a receiver of spirits. Okay, so they use kind of mechanistic framework like mediumship. But my experience of mediumship, actually attending seances and participating, and kind of fluid and dynamic. The medium it wasn't like the medium was sort of like a machine that could be tuned and tweaked, and it was like they were picking up on a signal. It was much more like an organic process of almost like birthing. So I came to think about these physical mediumship seances as organic processes, and then what I did was look into the history of psychical research and parapsychology, and see if there were any other kinds of strands running through that history that also approached the paranormal from an organic rather than from a mechanistic perspective. And I found a few interesting examples. Risch, he was a German biologist who was very involved in psychical research, at the turn of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. But his main background was in embryology. And his suggestion was, and he was observing things like, ectoplasmic materializations and that kind of thing. His suggestion was that these were what he called super extensions of normal biological processes. Okay, so I thought this is really interesting that there's a whole other strand within the history of paranormal research that has, tended away from the mechanistic model and has looked towards a more kind of organic framework for understanding these phenomena. Okay, so it's not like the medium is a receiver or a machine or a device. It's more when the start off with a kind of like medium would go into trance, and the circle leader would then watch their body for very small subtle movements which would indicate the presence of a spirit. And it was through this process of observation and interaction between the sitters or the circle leader and the medium's body that spirits essentially manifested in the room. So for instance, a medium might start twitching their hand, and then the circle leader will pick up on that and say on that. So the hand starts to move a little bit more. And eventually, maybe, over a process of weeks or months, this single movement of the hand will have turned into a full kind of communicating entity, maybe talking. I found an interesting parallel to this in the writings of one of my favorite anthropologists, Edith Turner, when she was describing her experience of the Ihamba ritual among the Ndembu in Zambia. And she talked about this ritual process of extracting a spirit, a malignant spirit from an afflicted patient. And she described it in terms of a calving, like as if a baby cow was going to be born. So the whole ritual process was like, went through like the ebb and flow, the buildup of tension and release and that kind of thing, in a similar way to a kind of a birthing process, a labor. Okay, and then the spirit is kind of manifested at the end of this process. So that's what my chapter is about. It's really asking, what would happen if we looked at these things like paranormal experiences, mediumship, all of those kind of things, from an organic perspective rather than from a mechanistic perspective, and to think about what kinds of insights, that kind of framework will reveal. So that's my chapter. I hope you find the rest of the talks interesting. I'll hand back to Diana.
Next, we had Miguel Algranti, but he hasn't arrived yet. So we're going to have Anastasios Panagiotopoulos describing his chapter, Broken Words, Tools of Oracular Articulacy in Afro-Cuban Divination. Go ahead, Anastasios.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Jack. Thank you all for being here. My chapter is based on my research in Cuba on Afro-Cuban religiosity, and it describes basic elements of my research. One of them is the focus I give on divination, which I think is a very important element in Afro-Cuban religiosity. I also intentionally do not although I make mentions, I try not to divide very strictly the various Afro-Cuban religious traditions that you can meet on the island, because I think that through divination, there is something that links all these traditions. And I rather focus on the experiences of building up messages, words, which might initially come very fragmented, very fragmentary, but they build up a path, as is let's say, the ethnographic term, a camino, a biographical life course, and these utterances build up towards being an essential part of one's life course, let's say. And one of the one of my, let's say, critical takes on mediation was that I tend to detect in the literature, especially in the anthropology of religion, which I'm mostly aware of, a tendency to see mediation always. There is this focus on mediation as a kind of distance that has to be, let's say, mediated. Various deities or spirits of the dead, divinities, are perceived as having a certain distance, which then is mediated. I think the norm in this literature is that the norm is the distance, so mediation affords proximity. But I also detect another trend which tries to inverse this, and which argues for immanence and proximity, but still the question is the same. Where are the deities? And if they are invisible, how they become visible? If they are there, how they come here? Um, and I problematize a bit this, let's say, conventional framework by arguing that the unseen, rather than being mediated, it mediates. And the ethnographic fleshing out of this is exactly what I was describing in the beginning, the building up of biographies which have as a vital part these oracular messages, which if you take, let's say, if you discuss with people, interviews, or even participate in the divinatory consultations, you see that it's very complex. It's never a matter of just consultation that you judge the veracity or not of a pronouncement, but people who have spent a large part of their lives consulting the oracles, a very intricate network of utterances and building up of these messages, let's say, is created. So I mainly focus on one person in my chapter, Fran, as I call him, and the opening of the ethnography is a moment of crisis where Fran loses his speech. And I thought it was a good example, exactly because I'm talking about words and oracular messages. The opening of the ethnography being exactly the opposite, losing speech all of a sudden, And then Fran begins a long path. This happened in the 1980s, his loss of speech. Slowly and variably consulting various oracles and different traditions you can encounter in Cuba. He builds a path in which he gets out of inarticulacy, of being inarticulate, and finally he becomes a diviner, let's say. So it's the interview, the biographical story of the diviner, and the two fields, let's say, of experience, of divinatory experience, are objects on the one hand, which carry also mythological signs according to the consultation, and perceptions through mainly the spiritist experience, but not only. And rather than focusing on the deities themselves, I make a heuristic. I treat the deities and the spirits of the dead. I call them heuristically signs and perceptions. So I rather try to avoid where these deities are, how do they come here, and I'm trying to elaborate on how, from a moment of crisis, stagnation, loss of speech, but not only loss of speech, but also it's much more encompassing feelings of stagnation. Through the oracular experience, you try to overcome these. And this is what deities mediate. So the deities and the spirits are the mediators from moments of inarticulacy to moments of articulacy, oracular articulacy, as I call it. But then again, exactly and precisely through this Afro-Cuban religious cosmos, other inarticulacies are created anew, and the tools, let's say, as I call them, which were meant to amend these broken paths, actually are a constant amendment and breaking of the machinery, let's say, of a biography. And yes, I call this a vicious circularity of articulacy and inarticulacy. And I think that would be a brief description of the chapter.
Excellent, Anastasios. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we would have Ehler Voss describe a bit of his chapter, but he prefers to give us a visual imagery instead. So he's actually going to show us a short movie.
Yes, thank you. It's about 4 minutes, and then I have 1 minute for some comments.
No problem.
Okay. So does it work now?
Starting first EVP session upstairs, 3rd floor, Meek Mansion, Saturday, June 13th, in the room with the flag on the floor in the corner. You're free. Yeah, no, just thinking. What's your favorite room in this house?
Hi, my name is Ina. What's your name?
Hello, it's Terry. I'm back. And I would really, really appreciate it if you would communicate with us tonight. We come here and we
have the utmost respect and would really love for you to communicate with us tonight.
I'm wondering if you are an adult or a child.
Hi, my name is Pam. Been here before a couple times. Can you tell me why you keep setting the device off that's in the doorway? Anybody just feel the ground shake? No. Could you feel it? No, I can. Did that window smoke? Hi, this is Laura. I'm sure you know me by now. I've been here too many times to count. And I brought more friends tonight to come and talk to you and communicate. So if you're here, can you light up the green light on that device in the doorway again? Thank you. All right, let's play this back and see if we can hear your answers now. So feel free to come forward and sit and listen for your voice. I'm going to play it back, and also if you weren't able to answer the questions the first go around, feel free to answer them again as they're played back over the speaker, because I do have other recorders recording to be able to pick up your voice, all right? Thank you. It's important noise outside. That's the one thing about having a window open, it's even more intensified. All right, here we go. All right, play this back. See what we get. I didn't hear you, Nikki. Did you feel it before? Yeah. It was almost like somebody sat right next to me, just boom. Okay. All right. Everyone else is completely quiet. All right. Come and listen for your voice. Oh, I was just gonna say, you don't have to talk quite so loud when you're asking questions, only because the stairway's right here. Oh, right. And if it'll travel right down. So just like a normal. Okay. Okay. Starting first EVP session, upstairs, third floor, week mansion, Saturday. Say hi. Say hi. Starting first EVP session, upstairs, third floor, week mansion, Saturday. Oh, yes. June 3rd.
Yeah, oh yes. So due to the limited time, I have to stop here. So this is an excerpt from a night of ghost hunting in California to give you a short impression of the ethnographic example to which I referred in that book. So if you want to know what else the ghost said on tape besides hi, and what sense I make of the ghost hunter's sense-making practices, read my chapter on hospitality and proof. So among other things, I discuss the ghost hunter's concept of proof and show that, contrary to what is often claimed, it is less about finding evidence for the existence of ghosts than about finding evidence for the presence of ghosts. That is, that ghost hunting is not something like an attempt at a scientific enterprise, but a fatic communion, which is about hospitality and acknowledging the reciprocity of interaction for its own sake. Thank you.
Thank you, Ehler. Okay, so Miguel Algranti is in the house, and he will present briefly his chapter, Semantics of Suffering, Torture Technologies, and Mediumship in Buenos Aires. Welcome, Miguel. You have 5 minutes.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for being here, and special thanks to Diana and Jack. So my chapter is about an ethnographic situation that happened to me in the year 2015, where at a sense, at the Basilio Scientific School, or Escuela Científico Basilio, which is one of the main spiritualistic churches or schools in Argentina. One of the mediums channeled the message from a spirit that was later identified with that of a un guerrillero. So it was basically the spirit of a desaparecido, which means the ones that were kidnapped by the military regime of Jorge Videla. And the incident described in the chapters shows how the picana, the electric rod that was used to torture the spirit of the person, have this special place in the cosmology of the spiritualistic beliefs. So there's a discussion about if spirit and fluid are the same as electricity, and that discussion turns into a research or a deepen of the medium, a development of that spirit, and the way they resolve these vibrations from the picana. It's in a very topographical kind of way, using the medium body as a surface, as a space. Actually, well, I'm not going to describe all the chapter, but my idea here was to confront this kind of typology of spirits, usually associated with state terrorism in Argentina. So we can say that in Argentina we have, in Latin America, we have a state production or a mass production of specters that are a usual typology in spiritualistic practices. And my idea in this chapter was to confront these kind of liminal entities, and with the technologies that produce them as a spirit, or as a narrative spirit. And it's in suffering. Well, I try to use suffering as a second-hand act, suffering not as pain, as in personal pain, but in watching pain, being witnessed of pain. That I found a common semantic network between torture, the electric rod, and the way the torturer used to produce confessions on the victim. And in mediumship, in spiritual mediumship, it's suffering also what makes eloquent the medium's body, that surface. So, well, that's basically the chapter. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was so late. I understand that the lunch was at 8 here in Argentina, so I was not expecting this. But thank you, and go to you, Diana.
Thank you, Miguel. So interesting. Okay, so next we jump again, and we have Andrea Lathrop Ligueros with a brief description of her chapter, Picturing the Unseen, Polaroid Practice and the Reenchantment of the Western World. Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, all those who joined us, and to Jack and Diana for convening this book. So, as other people have mentioned, my book chapter also comes from my PhD research, in which I was embedded in a community of Polaroid users. Most of you obviously would remember Polaroid photography. And what I tried to do during my PhD, and as a result, this chapter, was to understand why people continue to use these technologies, despite other technologies being available that are much easier and much cheaper to use. So what my chapter kind of tries to understand is is what is the meaning of Polaroid today in relation to digital photography, and how, and this is following my practitioners, my own kind of ethnographic findings, and how Polaroid, in a way, the value is not so much in this kind of nostalgia, but in the kind of embodied requirements that the practice demands from users. So this would mean that, and it would argue against this idea that technology should be like invisible to the user, which has been pretty much like that since the beginning. So, but why does it have to do with ghosts and spirits? So, drawing on the case study of Ted Sirius, which was a Chicago bellhop working in a hotel in 1960s. So this man was able to take pictures with his mind. So he would place the Polaroid camera on his head, and then images would appear. So he was massively studied by a very kind of serious psychiatrist from the US, and kind of try to understand how could this be possible. But my chapter, rather than arguing whether it is real or not, kind of draws into mediation theory to understand why is it that the camera, in this case, the Polaroid camera, the suitable media to connect to other realms. And it draws as well. So if you're interested in spirit photography and you want to read my chapter, you'll learn more about why is it photography that is linked to spirits and kind of ectoplasmic images and like mediumship, etc. I don't want to say too much because obviously I want you to go and read it. But I think what my chapter really draws on is this idea that despite transparency and immateriality being hailed as what people want in technology, Polaroid today, the current use of Polaroid or other analog technologies suggests that there's much more in technology than invisibility, and people want bodily embodiment, and then these technologies actually do enable paranormal or non-paranormal things to happen. So yes, please go and read it, and I would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Andrea. Up next would be Renzo Taddei with a look at specters of climate and the construction of ghostly realities in Brazil. Can you give us an idea of your chapter, Renzo?
Sure, thank you, Diana. Well, I am an anthropologist who works with science and technology studies in anthropology of science and technology. And I have been working with the field of climate sciences for over 2 decades now. Now, what happens is that I am a person who was born and raised inside of a spiritualistic tradition in Brazil. So inside of the panorama that has been called decolonial or critical studies, I see this as a form of reverse anthropology. So the point here is that at the same time as being part of a social and cultural universe where there's absolutely no trouble in contacting spirits in a regular base, what I found out was that it was tremendously difficult for scientists to materialize what we call climate. So the idea here is to address the issue of how things are materialized in society. So what kind of social resources and practices are in place when things that we cannot see without a lot of mediation, like viruses, but also climate. So in science, climate is a statistical construction. You can experience weather, but not climate. So when people like the World Meteorological Organization says that this was the hottest year in the last 50 years, what does that mean exactly if we don't have any form of experiencing that with our sensorial resources? And so the question is that in my work, the first part of the chapter is a description of how very immaterial things are materialized in the work of science. Well, what happens is later on in my career, I started working with this religious group in Brazil that work in the field of weather making. So they do it through mediumship, right? So, and the point there is not only that a lot of people do this around the planet, but the point of interest in this about this group in Brazil is that they work for governments and big companies like mining companies and the municipal government of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. So talking about people who are capable of doing calculations and so on, right? And so the issue is, I also found out that this organization, this mediumship group of people that are connected to an African Brazilian tradition called Umbanda, they hire scientists to provide them with scientific information. So this, what I try to do in the chapter is an interesting demonstration that most of the anti-religious discourse that are found inside of the world of science is very, very specific of the Protestant history of Europe. So it is as if the rest of the planet, through colonialism, inherited the scars of the religious conflicts of Europe, and that in a way affects how not only people across the planet perceive spirits, but how, the degree of legitimacy that practice and resources related to the communication with spirits encounter in how it gets reproduced. So basically, that's what I discuss in my chapter. Thank you. Thank you,
Renzo. And finally, Anne Dippel, who will briefly tell us about her chapter Ontological Opportunism, Reanimating the Inanimate in Physics and Science Communication at CERN.
Yes, thank you very much, Diana and Jack, for putting this together. First place, I have to say, I admire you, how you did this through all those years and with Corona. And I thank you for bringing all of us with our different approaches together. I would love to enter directly into a discussion with Renzo now, because I think there is lots of resonance in our fields, and especially on the question of whether we are also, and what kind of religious cosmological framework we are actually encountering when we encounter science. You put the Protestantism in front. Me coming from a German background, I have to put the traumatic scene of Catholicism versus Galileo Galilei as the Ur scene, and the questions whether we are not re-entering a time that is very similar to the mindset of Giordano Bruno, who has been burned for his beliefs of talking about natura naturans, a nature that is, as Diana was just saying, something that is coming to life through mediations, and that is not an actor in itself, but actually a truth that happens as a form of negotiation. And I encountered this whole questions by entering the physics scene at the European particle physics scene at CERN. And imagine you're going to the holy grail of high energy physics just to learn that the pristine objects, as Law and Lean would call them, that are made of nature there, measured with a complex entanglement of simulations of machines, humans, and data, are considered and communicated to as tricksters, as animated, and even manifestations to the outset of God, such as Iktomi for the Lakota Sioux. And to understand that what nature is coming into being through media and media technologies in these modern times in a post and decolonized anthropology is not anymore just something that is up to discussion for a classical modern concept of what science actually is considered to be. So by dealing with my high energy physicists and how they were communicating, what they're communicating amongst themselves and to others what they're doing, I entered a field in which actually at the big stage, the current shifting and shift of the categories that we are about to observe in a decentered world within the Anthropocene are actually staged and discussed, and where everything we learned from the fact that we have never been modern, as Bruno Latour once said, comes actually true, where the Terrans are working together and translators become either opportunists and communicate their ontology of modern scientific cosmology, just depending on how and with whom they're talking on the one hand, and on the other hand, manifestations of what is seen on the basis of computer simulations are giving power and empowerment to indigenous cosmologies. And that's why I really loved that in this whole book project of Jack and Diana, we are also taking up on the topic of animism that has been, at least in the European sense, for a long time been downgraded either as pagan, past, that we overcame with science, or as something that has been put into a colonial framework of, in a way, turning people's belief system, complex belief systems, into something that is nature, instead of understanding them as cultural manifestations of how to understand the world. And I try to unfold this by telling an ethnographic tale where these different cosmologies actually come together, and nothing more to be said about that. It's been nearly 8 years now that I'm doing research with physicists at CERN, and I am actually astounded that in these 8 years, I observed this shift in the way people are talking, that people that I was talking to, and that's the main person, it's I call it John, my informant, that this John, in the first time we meet, would talk about positive concepts of nature and would positivistly argument, and then 6-7 years later you meet him, he has been at Standing Rock and he talks about particles as tricksters. And these shifts in languages are fascinating, and they are also irritating because you as people here in this book launch would follow me, but I think others are still very much astounded about this kind of resonances between new materialism, science and technology studies, new animism within a new post-colonial, decentered, anthropocentric framework. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. That was fascinating. I guess now we have 8 minutes for questions or comments. If anyone has any, you can write it in the chat section, or you can, I guess, raise your hand, and I can get you.
We've just got to go by the book, right?
I mean, I think what we're doing, I mean, I don't think what we're doing is necessarily original as such. I think what we're doing is sort of pushing some of the things that have been coming in anthropology and also in the social sciences for a while. And so what we're doing is sort of rethinking the links of religious and spiritual language and science, but also the spiritual dimensions of technologies. And I think that this gives birth, in a sense, to something which is greater than its parts, certainly greater than an anthropological dualistic language would imply, right? And I think also that what we could do is push these anthropological notions, right? Especially in relation to what Anne was saying in terms of animism, in terms of these traditional frames of that that the invisible is basically the function of somebody's belief, so their mental states. I think all this needs to change in anthropology. We need to find different languages to do it. And in this book, certainly in the introduction, we've been a bit partial towards material semiotics, but I think it can really be any kind of language which dissolves these tensions and these dualisms, and which basically sees the field as inspiration for concepts, right? So in my own journey, I kind of come from a sort of ontological anthropology, and now I'm shifting to other ways of seeing these same phenomena, right? So in my personal journey, I've I've always been interested in how we conceptualize the invisible, right? So these notions, these very retrograde notions of function and of belief, and even of theater that people like I.M. Lewis had, are just not relevant to understanding I think the kind of complexities that come from unpiecing these relationships between the invisible and technologies, which is why I find this idea of religious or spiritual paranormal matter so interesting, right? Because it really confronts us with our partialities as citizens of the Western world, where the object is just an object and technology is mere mediatory matter. But in a sense, I don't think it is. I don't know if anyone else has any other comment. Jack?
A question.
Sorry. Yeah, a kind of questiony, commenty thing. How far do you feel we are in, because listening to all of this, the way that I would understand it is that so if everything starts in our consciousness, then all of these things, whether we are connecting through medium or using technology, we are just dealing with our own consciousness and our relationship with the world through that. How far do you think we are in understanding that? Do you feel this is something that is being considered more and more now, or is that just still way off the mark in terms of people's understanding?
I think it's moving at like different levels, isn't it? Different speeds. You know, some, like for example, let's say we were to look at like an indigenous society, you know, where the concepts and all those kinds of things that they use to make sense of the world are radically different, and they might a Western framework are. So, you know, and then there are people again within like mainstream Western culture, you know, like mediums and all of these various different groups who are, you know, are also exploring that, and they're already, you know, maybe they're already in that place. So it's just, it moves at different speeds, I think, and some people are already in that space and other people are on their way there, and some people very far from it as well.
Can I just add something?
Thanks.
Before giving the word to Renzo and to Ehler, who have their hand up? I think that the idea that everything starts in consciousness is kind of problematic also for anthropology. And personally, that's not where I would begin.
Okay.
So that's sort of an intuitive thing, right? So, I mean, we are people, so we understand that consciousness is us and we sort of expand outwards. But in a sense, I think in this book, what we're aiming for is something a bit more, not dialectic, but sort of co-constitutive, right? So what we're looking at is something which emerges from this dialogue that we have with materials, with objects, with technologies, with something which cannot exist, or perhaps can exist, but at a completely different level, without these other things that we engage with, because we are situated people. I mean, we're embodied people, and that embodiment is not just in relation to our own bodies, but in relation to our world, right? So we think with our world, and I think sometimes it's a question of relationality, and other times it's a question of basically attempting a sort of intermittent or more sustained contact with something which is enabled by materiality. So I think the emphasis on matter here is extremely important. And I would say that analytically, our consciousness is absolutely dependent on the environment in which we live. But that's my opinion.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Diana and Jack, thank you. So this is Nick. I think, Diana, what was interesting was I heard you begin by questioning the notion of the invisible. And in my own work, I've always got one eye on scientism and its influence through sociology and anthropology and so on, to the extent the argument is that nothing exists which can't be physically weighed and measured. And yet the modern scientific worldview, if it is based in, well, for example, quantum mechanics, or even if we go back to optics, deals with the invisible. In fact, the invisible is fundamental to the modern scientific worldview. And so, you know, the invisible is quite normal. And so, you know, astrophysics is preoccupied by phenomena such things as dark matter and dark energy, or cold dark matter and cold dark energy, which are invisible and only are thought to exist because of variabilities in measurements. And so I think that you know, that's a fundamental question. I really like the title of the book, Mattering the Invisible. And we know that matter is a problematic concept, but as you pointed out, so is the invisible. And I think that's a really interesting starting point for a book on the invisible. So I haven't yet been able to read the book, but you certainly piqued my interest by that simple statement.
Fantastic. Thank you. Renzo, I think you were first, and then Ehler. You had your hand up as well, right? Oh, no, you didn't? Okay. So, Renzo.
Okay, yeah, I have a few comments. It's the two things. One, it's interesting, this comment about the invisible. Now, what I think is a crucial matter, at least for someone working with issues like I do, like related to scientific concepts that are statistical constructions or conceptual constructions and so on, is it's not only whether you can see or not, is the degree of uncertainty that is associated to the phenomenon, and what is the threshold of uncertainty over which people start considering the thing as a fact or as a matter. Because this uncertainty never drops to zero. There's always some degree of uncertainty that is unsurmountable, and it's always there. So how to socially and culturally naturally managing and dealing with these levels of uncertainty, and what makes some fields of action settle down for some levels of uncertainty and not others. Just for you to, those of you who didn't read the book, to become interested. One of the provocations I make in my chapter is that what I say is, if you take the level of uncertainty in the climate sciences and psychiatry, and you apply that to paranormal, or if you take the other way around, if you take the degree of uncertainty that is expected from paranormal studies to accept them as facts, probably psychiatry and climate sciences would not pass the test. And of course, that's a provocation, because it's not easy to do these kinds of measurements, right? But I think the provocation is valid. And the other thing is that, the paranormal very often in the West is understood as noise and ontological excess. And so it is very important to understand that this is very particular of a certain experience of the paranormal. Even the term paranormal is very particular of a certain place and time in this planet. For most, I would say that for most people on this planet, these things would not be paranormal, would not be noise, no ontological excess. So this is what I would like to say.
Thank you. That's, yeah, your comparison to psychiatry is completely on the ball, because, well, people may not know, but psychiatric illnesses are actually not locatable anywhere in the brain. So there's sort of epiphenomena, if we can call it that, of diagnosis of different kinds of symptoms. And also, yeah, it's interesting what you say in terms of the fact that in most places in the world, paranormal stuff is not paranormal. It's not strange. It's not ontological excess. It's normal, right? And I studied in Cuba for about 15 years, and the paranormal there is normality, and not just in terms of the things that you may dream of, but the things that you may hear in your ear or see in terms of vision. So these are not at all strange. Thank you.
Can I ask a question, if possible?
Of course.
Hi, I've been completely mute and no video throughout the whole thing, but I've really enjoyed it, and thank you for inviting me. My name is Tamzin Powell, and I'm a writer and anthropologist. I normally write about witchcraft, but I was very fascinated to have a look at this book, and I will be buying the book. I just wanted to ask, where do you think the ability to remote view fits into this particular area? In terms of psychic or channeling, or are we looking at something else? Is it actually a scientific thing in terms of, you know, the normal way science treats things? It's because it's very little research in remote viewing, yet it is an ability that seems to be growing amongst a lot of people that I've come across, including myself.
Jack, do you want to answer?
Yeah, well, I think this is the interesting thing about we might call like paranormal experiences, like remote viewing or out-of-body experiences or things like that, is that they collapse these distinctions that we make, you know, in the Western world between inside and outside. And I think that's why they're really interesting in the context of this idea of, you know, of extended minds. So perhaps like in out-of-body experiences or remote viewing experiences and things like that, that is actually the experience of the extended self, if you know what I mean, or, you know, the idea that, you know, our cognition and that kind of thing extends out into the physical environment as well. So I think things like remote viewing, out-of-body experiences, and astral travel, and all sorts of things like that, you know, although they might seem like they're actually, you know, like non-physical experiences, you know, that's the usual thing that's talked about, isn't it? You know, in the paranormal, to rally against materialism and that kind of thing, to say that it's all non-physical and spiritual and that kind of thing. But actually, I think it could be, you know, like these experiences are like, yeah, us experiencing that fundamental interconnection of mind and matter. So it's not really that we're traveling outside of our bodies. It's more like we actually don't have bodies, or you know, we're kind of already enmeshed within it. Just a thought.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it depends how we perceive humanity, whether we believe in an illusionary universe or whether we believe in a physical universe. And I know many people who actually do believe in an illusionary universe, that we create what we see anyway. So therefore, you can go into the realms of the other world and meet the Fae and participate in magical practices, etc. But yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Perhaps we should think about wrapping up. We're beyond the time.
Yep.
Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you very much, Nick Campion, for hosting us. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, the contributors of the book. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I hope you get the book and you read it.
Okay.
ESP. That's a very, very apt acronym.
It's perfect.